In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was about to begin. Across the English Channel, over 150,000 Allied troops prepared to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. Among the 5 landing zones, one would earn a name that would echo through history as the bloodiest Omaha Beach. The men who would assault this stretch of Norman coastline had no idea they were sailing toward what would become known as the longest day. They were ordinary soldiers, farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, about to face an extraordinary test of courage that would determine the fate of the free world. As darkness gave way to the gray dawn of D-Day, thousands of landing craft cut through the choppy waters of the English Channel. The men inside these steel boxes had been training for this moment for months, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited on the beaches of Normandy. Omaha Beach stretched for 6 miles along the Norman coast, a deceptively beautiful expanse of sand and shingle that rose gradually to a seawall, beyond which towered imposing bluffs. These cliffs, rising up to 150 feet above the beach, had been transformed by the German Wehrmacht into a fortress of concrete and steel. The German defenders of Omaha Beach were not the second-rate troops that Allied intelligence had predicted. The 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit recently moved to the area, had spent months preparing for this exact moment. They had turned the bluffs into a killing field, with interlocking fields of fire from machine gun nests, artillery, positions, and mortar emplacements. The Allied plan seemed straightforward on paper. A massive naval bombardment would soften the German defenses, followed by an airstrike to finish the job. Then the infantry would land, quickly cross the beach, and establish a foothold on the bluffs. The planners estimated that organized resistance would crumble within hours, but war rarely follows the plan. At 0550 hours, the largest naval bombardment in history began. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire on the German positions with a roar that could be heard for miles. For 40 minutes, thousands of shells screamed through the morning air, impacting the bluffs in massive explosions that shook the ground and lit up the sky. The soldiers in the landing craft watched in awe as the coastline disappeared behind walls of smoke and flame. Surely, they thought, nothing could survive such devastating firepower. The German defenders must be dead or fleeing by now. But the bombardment, though spectacular, was largely ineffective. Most of the shells fell inland, behind the German positions. The concrete bunkers and steel-reinforced pillboxes had been designed to withstand such attacks. When the guns fell silent, the German defenders emerged from their shelters, checked their weapons, and prepared for the assault they knew was coming. The air attack that followed was equally disappointing. Heavy cloud cover forced the bombers to release their payloads blind, and most of the bombs fell harmlessly in the fields beyond the beach. The German defensive positions remained intact. Their guns trained on the water, where the first wave of landing craft was now approaching. As the naval bombardment lifted, an ominous silence fell over the beach. The only sounds were the crash of waves against the sand and the distant rumble of engines as hundreds of landing craft moved toward shore. The German defenders waited, fingers on triggers, eyes fixed on the approaching boats. At 0630 hours, the first wave of assault troops began their final approach to Omaha Beach. The 1st Infantry Division, veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, led the attack alongside the 29th Infantry Division, a National Guard unit seeing its first combat. The landing craft, designed to carry 36 men each, were overcrowded and unstable in the rough surf. Many of the soldiers were seasick from the channel crossing, but their discomfort was about to be forgotten in the face of a far more immediate threat. As the boats approached the beach, the German defenders opened fire. The distinctive sound of MG-42 machine guns nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, for their incredible rate of fire filled the air. These weapons could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and their bullets swept across the water like deadly rain. The first landing craft to reach the beach were met with a wall of fire. As the ramps dropped, German machine gunners and riflemen concentrated their fire on these narrow openings. Men fell before they could even step onto the sand. Others, weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment, stumbled into water that was deeper than expected and drowned within sight of the shore. Those who made it off the boats found themselves in a nightmare. The beach offered no cover, just open sand stretching for 300 yards to the seawall. German artillery observers on the bluffs called down mortar and artillery fire with deadly precision. The carefully planned assault was disintegrating into chaos. Within minutes of the first landings, Omaha Beach had become a killing field. The assault troops, instead of advancing rapidly across the beach as planned, found themselves pinned down by withering fire from the bluffs above. Any movement drew immediate attention from German gunners who had spent months preparing for this moment. The beach began to fill with casualties. Wounded men cried out for medics who couldn't reach them. The incoming tide threatened to drown those who couldn't crawl to higher ground. Equipment vital to the assault Bangalore torpedoes to clear wire obstacles, radios to coordinate the attack, weapons to return fire lay scattered and abandoned in the surf. From their positions on the bluffs, the German defenders had a perfect view of the slaughter below. Their machine guns, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, could sweep the entire beach. Artillery and mortar crews, protected by concrete bunkers, rained shells down on the crowded beach with devastating effect. The German 352nd Infantry Division had trained for this moment. They knew every inch of the beach, every approach route, every piece of cover. They had prepared for months, and now their preparation was paying off in Allied blood. For 2 hours, the situation remained desperate. Landing craft continued to arrive, but many were hit before they could unload their troops. The beach was becoming clogged with debris-destroyed boats, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of the dead and wounded. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, individual acts of courage began to change the tide of battle. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants who refused to give up, began to find ways forward. They used shell craters for cover, moved during lulls in the firing, and supported each other with covering fire. One such leader was Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, whose words would become legendary. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead, and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. Meanwhile, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was fighting its way up the cliffs at Point du Hoc, tasked with destroying German artillery positions that threatened the entire landing force. Using ropes and ladders, these elite soldiers scaled the 100-foot cliffs under fire, only to discover that the guns they had come to destroy had been moved. But their assault drew German reserves away from other parts of the beach, and their example inspired other units to keep fighting. Slowly, painfully, the deadlock on Omaha Beach began to break dot as the desperate situation on the beach became clear. The U.S. Navy made a crucial decision. Destroyer captains, seeing the carnage on shore, moved their ships dangerously close to the beach, so close that they risked running aground, and began firing directly at German positions on the bluffs. The destroyer USS McCook came so close to shore that her captain could see individual German soldiers in their bunkers. Her 5-inch guns, firing at point-blank range, began to silence the machine gun nests that had been dominating the beach for hours. Other destroyers followed suit, and soon a line of warships was providing direct fire support to the troops on the beach. The naval gunfire was devastatingly accurate, and for the first time since the landings began, the German defenders found themselves under real pressure. This naval support gave the assault troops the breathing room they needed. Small groups began, to move forward, using the cover of smoke and the suppressive fire from the ships. They attacked the German positions from multiple directions, forcing the defenders to divide their attention. Engineers, working under fire, began to clear paths through the wire obstacles and minefields. Bangalore torpedoes, finally brought forward, from the beach, blasted gaps in the German defenses. Slowly, methodically, the American forces began to establish footholds on the bluffs. By noon, 6 hours after the first landings, American forces had finally established a precarious foothold on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The breakthrough came not from any single dramatic assault, but from dozens of small unit actions by soldiers who refused to give up. The German defenders, their positions under constant attack from land and sea, began to fall back. Their carefully prepared defensive plan was crumbling as American forces infiltrated their lines from multiple directions. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had fought so effectively in the morning, was running out of men and ammunition. As the day progressed, the beach that had been a scene of such horror began to transform. Engineers cleared obstacles and established supply routes. Medical personnel set up aid stations to treat the wounded. Landing craft began bringing in reinforcements and supplies rather than just more casualties. But the cost had been enormous. Of the approximately 34,000 American troops who landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, nearly 2,400 became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The price of victory had been paid in blood and courage. From the German perspective, the battle for Omaha Beach represented both a tactical victory and a strategic failure. The 352nd Infantry Division had fought magnificently, inflicting heavy casualties on the attackers and holding their positions for hours, longer than anyone had expected. But the German High Command had made a fatal miscalculation. They had expected the main Allied assault to come at Pas-de-Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. As a result, they had concentrated their strongest defenses there, leaving Normandy relatively weak. More critically, the German reserves that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea were held too far inland, waiting for orders that never came. Adolf Hitler himself had to authorize their movement, and he was asleep when the invasion began. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the Allies had established their foothold. The defenders of Omaha Beach had done everything asked of them and more, but they were fighting alone, without the support they needed to turn their tactical success into strategic victory. The window of opportunity to defeat the invasion was closing as American forces moved inland from the beaches. They encountered a different kind of warfare. The Norman countryside, with its network of hedgerows and stone farmhouses, favored the defender. Every field was a potential fortress, every hedge a potential ambush site. The bocage country, as it was known, would become a nightmare for the advancing Americans. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls, topped with thick vegetation, divided the landscape into a checkerboard of small fields. Each one had to be cleared individually, often at the cost of heavy casualties. But the momentum was now with the Allies. More troops were pouring ashore every hour, along with tanks, artillery, and supplies. The German defenders, cut off from reinforcement and resupply, were fighting a delaying action rather than trying to hold fixed positions. Villages that had been under German occupation for 4 years began to see their first American soldiers. The reception was mixed. Some French civilians welcomed the liberators with tears of joy, while others, traumatized by years of war, remained cautious and fearful. As night fell on June 6, 1944, the Allies had achieved their primary objective. They had established a foothold on the European continent. But the cost had been staggering, particularly at Omaha Beach, where the casualties were far higher than anyone had predicted. The hospital ships offshore began to fill with wounded soldiers. Makeshift aid stations on the beach worked around this clock to treat the injured. For every man who had made it off the beach, others had paid the ultimate price. The names of the dead would be etched in stone at the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, overlooking the beach where they fell. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California. They had come from every corner of America to fight for freedom, and too many of them would never go home. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The foothold they had won with their blood would grow into a full-scale invasion. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops would be fighting their way across France. Within a year, Nazi Germany would be defeated. The success at Omaha Beach, despite its terrible cost, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The opening of the Second Front in Western Europe forced the Germans to fight a war on two fronts, dividing their already strained resources. The psychological impact was equally important. For the first time since the war began, German forces were in full retreat on a major front. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and resistance movements across occupied Europe took heart from the news of the Allied landings. For the French people, D-Day represented the first glimmer of hope after 4 years of occupation. The sight of Allied soldiers fighting their way inland meant that liberation was no longer just a dream. It was a reality. It was coming closer every day. The battle for Omaha Beach had been won, but the war was far from over. The soldiers who had survived the landing would face months of bitter fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and ultimately to the heart of Nazi Germany itself. Today, Omaha Beach is peaceful. The sand where so many young men died is now walked by tourists and pilgrims who come to honor their memory. The bluffs that once bristled with German guns are now home to monuments and museums dedicated to preserving the story of D-Day. The American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer contains the graves of 9,387 American servicemen who died in the liberation of Europe. Row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stretch across the manicured grass, each one representing a life cut short in the service of freedom. The survivors of Omaha Beach, now in their late 90s, are among the last living witnesses to one of history's most crucial battles. Their stories, preserved in interviews and memoirs, serve as a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. They were not professional soldiers for the most part. They were citizen soldiers, civilians in uniform who answered their country's call when democracy itself was under threat. They came from farms and factories, from small towns and big cities, united by a common cause and a shared determination to defeat fascism. June 6, 1944 was indeed the longest day for the men who fought at Omaha Beach. In the space of a few hours, they experienced the full spectrum of human emotion: terror, courage, despair, and ultimately triumph. They proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, determined individuals can change the course of history. The beach that had been a killing field in the morning became a symbol of hope by evening. The foothold won with such sacrifice would grow into a full-scale invasion that would sweep across Europe and bring an end to the Nazi regime. The story of Omaha Beach is not just about military strategy or tactical decisions. It is about the ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when their nation and the world needed them most. They remind us that freedom is not free, that democracy must be defended, and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Their legacy lives on in the free nations of Europe, in the democratic institutions they fought to preserve, and in the memory of all who understand that some things are worth fighting for. The boys who became men on the beaches of Normandy showed the world what Americans are capable of when they stand together for a righteous cause. On Omaha Beach, they wrote with their blood a chapter in the great story of human freedom. It is a story that must never be forgotten, a sacrifice that must never be diminished, and a legacy that must never be lost. The longest day ended, but the memory remains eternal.